In both commercial and home studios all across the entire planet, there's typically one common thread, and that is thousands and tens of thousands of dollars invested in outboard gear. Some people swear by outboard gear, saying that they could never, ever get the same results that they get without it, while other people claim that all of the tools that they ever need are in the box, and they're perfectly content with that workflow. So the question is, outboard gear, is it worth it? Let's talk about it. Hey friends, for those of you who are new here, I'm Daniel from iosoundstudio.com, where my goal is to impact the world with music and to inspire and to teach other people how to do the very same thing. And in today's video, I want to talk to you guys about outboard gear. Now, just a disclaimer, I am not intending to act as if I have all of the answers, because I absolutely do not. But I do want to share some of my own thoughts and some of my own opinions and some of my own experiences, both using outboard gear and staying 100% in the box as well. Over the years, I've had some really cool experiences and opportunities to use incredible outboard gear, like gear ranging into the tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars, even up to using an SSL hybrid console for both tracking and for recording, and just so many vintage pieces of gear that sounded absolutely incredible. And now, on a very regular basis, I use just a handful of pieces of outboard gear, and my collection is growing. I have the intention, at least, of growing it over the next few years. And so I'm pretty acquainted with outboard gear, and it's a very regular part of my workflow. But that being said, before I ever got into the outboard gear world, for the first probably half of the years that I've been producing music, so probably the first 5 years, maybe 6, I was exclusively in the box, only relegated and limited to plugins. All that to say, I've spent quite a lot of time in both worlds, and so I think that my opinion at least has a little bit of legitimacy, being that I've made music with both outboard gear and without outboard gear. In short, just to cut straight to the chase, for the question, is outboard gear worth it? My answer is yes. Now, is outboard gear necessary? Absolutely not. You do not need outboard gear to make great music. In fact, I would go so far as to say that waiting until you have outboard gear, or you have this great mic or this great preamp or this awesome outboard compressor, can actually be a huge hindrance and a huge limiter and barrier between you and making great music. And so I actually would absolutely not make your action of whether or not to start making music or to keep making music contingent upon whether or not you have X piece of gear. I think that is the worst perspective to have when it comes to making music. Make music now with whatever you have, and as you grow in your craft and you have more budget to put towards gear, then, and when it makes sense financially and practically from a business perspective, then I would suggest investing in more gear. But don't wait until you have the gear to make the music. And the reality is that you can make phenomenal sounding music without outboard gear. There are plenty of Grammy-nominated producers, mixing engineers, maybe even mastering engineers who work 100% in the box. And so don't act as though you need outboard gear to make great sounding music, because you don't. At the end of the day, there will never, ever be any layperson who will ever listen to your music that's streamed on Spotify, Apple Music, Tidal, or even played on the radio, that will think to themselves, I wonder if the lead vocals in this song were tracked through a vintage 251 into a vintage LA2A and then into a vintage Uri 1176. That simply won't happen. No layperson's gonna care what preamps you used. No layperson is gonna care what cables you used. No layperson is gonna care about any of those details. At the end of the day, laypeople only care about the emotions that your music makes them feel. Full stop, end of discussion. Really, that's all that they care about. No one cares about the gear. But that being said, for those of us whose ears are trained, for those of us who have spent years cultivating and honing our skill set and have a huge appreciation for the details and the fidelity of music, those people will notice, and they might even ask some of those questions. And I think making music for those people, even that tiny 1% of the populace that's gonna enjoy your music the way you mean for your music to be enjoyed, I think it's worth it. Especially if you're making music professionally. If you're just a hobbyist, I would say save your money, invest it in the S&P 500 or in some other investment like real estate, I probably wouldn't suggest spending tens of thousands of dollars on outboard gear, especially if you're not a professional. So, all that being said, in my opinion, here are a few reasons that I think outboard gear is very helpful. First off, outboard gear gives you a tactile experience. In my opinion, using outboard gear physically connects you more to the music that you're making. And I think that's actually a very big deal. Working on music is an emotional experience, and having something physically in front of you that you can physically connect with and interact with, I think makes the experience more emotional. Second, outboard gear requires that you use a higher level of intentionality in the choices that you make. There aren't any undo buttons when it comes to hardware. Yes, you can take pictures, and yes, you can log the decisions you made on your outboard gear to go back for revisions and that kind of thing, but it's not as simple as hitting Command Z or Control Z. So you're forced to actually critically think about the decisions you're making and to stick with them, especially on the tracking side. Using outboard gear can also be a lot faster. It can be so much faster. And I found that just reaching out and physically turning knobs can be so much quicker than clicking and dragging settings on a compressor, for example, in my DAW. I found that it is way faster for me to dial in an outboard compressor than it is for me to dial in a digital compressor. My second point is that outboard gear really helps you focus on using your ears and not just your eyes. When you're mixing in the box especially, it's extremely tempting to use your eyes to mix, especially with things like graphic EQs, for example. When you're using a digital EQ plugin, especially, it's very tempting to be thinking to yourself while you're shaping that vocal, oh well, this is where I normally cut and this is where I normally boost on a female vocal. Using outboard gear really forces you to listen to what that vocal needs. Now, can you train yourself to do this on the box without needing to use external hardware? 100% you can. You absolutely can. But I do think that because the nature of these plugins is literally more visible and colorful, I definitely think that it's harder to kind of bypass that in the box. That's me personally. Maybe you guys are better at that than I am, but for me personally, I've definitely noticed that I struggle more with especially EQ choices when I'm in the box versus when I'm not. I found that when I'm using EQ and compression on outboard units, I'm much more tuned into thinking, what is the natural character of this vocal through this particular microphone in the way that this particular singer is singing? And all those different things really play into the choices that you make when it comes to EQ and compression. There's no one size fits all. There are good starting points. There are decent presets that you can kind of start with, but really, I think every single vocal, every single instrument, etc., is its own unique thing and requires its own special attention. Here's another thing for me personally. I don't think this is for everybody, but for me, once I started using outboard compressors, my ears started to adapt to being able to hear much more clearly what compression actually sounds like. And I don't just mean what it sounds like for the actual instrument to be compressed or the actual signal to be compressed, meaning it's kind of squashed down a little bit, like the dynamic range is decreased. But I've also learned to listen to the actual sonic character of compressors, the harmonic saturation that it adds, for example, and how much I hear that saturation depending on how much compression the compressor is actually doing. And since I've kind of developed my ear with outboard gear, outboard compressors, I've also found that I'm approaching the way that I compress with plug-in compressors differently, and I'm listening for the same kinds of things. I'll talk more about this in a second, but with outboard compressors, there's a lot more coloration than with plugins, and plugins definitely have a very hard time replicating that. And that brings me to my last point. Outboard gear generally sounds more pleasing, and a compressor is actually a really good example of this. Reason being that with hardware compressors, you can really push them and bring out a whole new color and amount of saturation through the compressor as the compressor is working harder. And that can actually bring out a very nice, pleasing, rich, colorful sound that is not replicated very well by the majority of plugins that I've heard, at least. Now, there are a couple that do a pretty good job at this, but if we're speaking in generalities, generally, outboard compressors tend to do this much easier and much more musically than plugins. Also, outboard gear just has a certain analog warmth and character to it that is not really replicatable, if that's a word, through plugins. It's hard to explain, but it sounds organic. That's the best way that I can kind of describe it. And if you've used Outboard gear, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Songs that are done completely in the box, recorded through, maybe cheaper preamps, and are mixed entirely 100% in the box, never really touching Outboard gear at all in the recording or in the mixing phase or the mastering phase, tend to sound more digital. Again, this is one of those intangibles that's kind of hard to qualify, but they sound a little bit more electronic-y. Now, if you know the science behind what this is and why it happens, I'd love to read it below in the comments if you want to share. But I've noticed, even if I do the majority of the mixing and the majority of all of that in the box, and then on the master bus, I run it through a pair of preamps, it comes alive in a whole entire different way. And it's noticeable, for me at least. At this point, for me, there is not a single song that I work on that I don't mix through preamps in the final stage. Also, Outboard gear tends to be a bit more forgiving. You can push it harder and it will take more of that, and it will be more lenient with your mistakes, if you will. Some plugins tend to be very harsh in the way that they respond to big moves, especially. And so I have found that, for example, if you're using an outboard compressor, you're pushing it to like 20 dB of gain reduction or like 18 decibels of gain reduction. Like, you're pushing it hard. They're typically way more forgiving and actually still sound very, very smooth. Whereas opposed to if you're pushing a plug-in compressor to 20 decibels of gain reduction, it's not going to be as forgiving, and it's typically not going to sound as musical. Now, again, this is kind of a generality. There are definitely some outboard compressors that don't do this well, and there are some in the box plugins that do this phenomenally or quite well. But I would still go so far as to say that I don't think that they can be compared. At least I have not come across any plugin that I found that gives me the same kind of sound and result as an outboard compressor. Lastly, people are much more prone to take you seriously if you have outboard gear. Now, is it always the case? Not necessarily, but I do think that there is a psychological element where if people walk into your room and you're a producer or you're a mixer and they see racks of preamps, hard synths, all these kinds of things, they are going to take you much more seriously and take the time that they've purchased in the studio with you much more seriously than if you literally just have a computer or a laptop on your desk. People are shallow, and there is a visual component to having outboard gear that really makes people take their time with you in the studio much more seriously. And in my opinion, having outboard gear to some degree validates your expertise as a producer, mixer, a mastering engineer, etc. People like shiny things at the end of the day. You can hate it. It is shallow, I'm not gonna lie, but sometimes that definitely helps. If that's the only reason that people are booking you, there are other problems there. People should also hire you based off your skills. That should be the primary thing, but they're also going to compare you against this producer and that producer and this mixing engineer and this mixing engineer, and they all have these fancy studios. So that is a thing to keep in mind. So friends, with that being said, thank you so much for stopping by for another video. If you want to support this channel more directly, one free way you can support me is by hitting that subscribe button below and sharing this with a friend or another producer or mixing engineer that you think could benefit from it. And if you want to chip in a couple of dollars to my Patreon a month to get exclusive content that's not here and to get early content that's released on Patreon before it hits YouTube, let me know. You can check out the link in the description below as well. It's patreon.com/iomusic. And I'm also documenting the process of me writing and recording and producing an album for myself under my artist project. And all of that insider exclusive stuff is going to be posted on my Patreon. So if you want to follow along the process there and also get insights to mix breakdowns, production breakdowns, etc. in full detail with no ads or anything like that, you can check out my Patreon. So anyways, thank you guys so much for being here. I'll see you again very soon with another video. And by the way, my daughter was in fact born like right after I posted that last video. So if my posting schedule is a little bit wacky, that's why. I have 2 kids now. But anyways, see you guys. Love you. Love you.